Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the NAPE launch of our new beginner's guide to planning enforcement. I hope you're all safe and well, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Neil Whitaker. I'm the chair of NAPE, and you're going to be hearing from a number of the NAPE Management Committee today, as between us we have authored the beginner's guide to planning enforcement. This is the first edition of it, and it's been very kindly funded by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and the NAPE committee will keep it updated as we go in the future. So before we get going, and we are joined again today, many of you would have joined us at the NAPE conference a few weeks ago, but we have Tim Crawshaw with us again, so thank you very much, Tim, for joining us. I'm just going to go through a few quick housekeeping points, and then I'm going to hand you over to Tim to say a few words before we get going. So for attendees, you're all muted, so we can't hear from you or see you, unfortunately, but we do know you're there. We hope you enjoy the webinar today. And if you have any questions, and once we've heard from each of the presenters, there's some time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session. So if you've got any questions as we go, you should see a Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So please feel free to put any questions in there as we go, and we'll try and deal with them towards the end. There's also a chat tab. If you want to communicate with other attendees, please feel free to use that as the presentations are being made. The webinar is being recorded, and hopefully we'll be able to put that on the NAPE section of the RTPI website once we have finished today. The actual guide itself, the beginner's guide, is now available to download, again from the NAPE section of the RTPI website. So if you haven't had a look there already, please go and have a look. It is ready to download from there. Also, there's a handouts tab on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you click on that, there's also a link to the beginner's guide, so you can get it there as well. If you lose connectivity as an attendee at any point during the conference, please just rejoin via the link that you have been sent from us at NAPE. And if you want to ensure that your Wi-Fi is at its optimum level for the webinar, please think about disconnecting any other connections you have with it at the moment. So each of our speakers today will talk for about 5 or so minutes about the various sections of the guide which they have authored. And then, as I said at the beginning, we will take some questions towards the end. So now if I hand over to Tim Crawshaw, he's just going to provide us with some opening remarks. Over to you, Tim.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Neil. Good afternoon, everybody. I think most of you will have seen me at the conference, but I will introduce myself formally. I'm Timothy Crawshaw. I'm the Vice President. I think in December, I think people start calling you President-elect for some reason. I think it all changes. To be President, and I've been invited to join you today to say a few words up front about the Beginner's Guide to Planning Enforcement. I've been lucky enough to have a quick read, and I found it interesting and engaging, and I think it's a really good example, and I think it's good precedent for us in terms of other networks and parts of what we do, that this has been a collaborative effort, and it's very much got different voices that are talking, but towards one end, towards that outcome. I think it's an awesome effort, and actually, you know, there's something to learn. I'm having my theme in December is every day is a school day, and I'm certainly learning something all the time. And there's a lot of really good practice in there, and a lot of encouragement. So as a beginner's guide, I think it's a really awesome piece of work. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the co-authors today, and then we can have a discussion and question time afterwards. So really looking forward to this webinar today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, so we'll move on now to look at the guide itself, and we're going to hear from some of the authors. If you've got a copy of the guide in front of you, we're going to go through it in chronological order. The guide itself is very much aimed at those starting out in planning enforcement. Generally, that will be with a local planning authority. But it's also a very interesting document if you just have a general interest in enforcement and wondering what enforcement officers get up to and how, for example, a complaint will be dealt with if you were to make one to your local authority. So what we're going to do first, we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to look at some starting points for an enforcement officer. And we're going to be hearing from Craig Meikle. So Craig sits on NAPE as the Scottish representative and has done so since 2020. He's a senior planning officer within the enforcement section of the City of Edinburgh Council and has worked there since 2015. Prior to this, he worked in development management in several other local authorities, including East Lothian, Glasgow, and some other ones. And Renfrewshire as well. So Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Neil, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think one of the big misconceptions of planning enforcement is that it is a punitive regime where we go out on a regular basis serving enforcement notices on innocent people and pulling down unauthorised buildings at will. And certainly that was my preconception prior to entering the profession back in 2015. However, stories such as the Hidden Castle in Surrey, which was one disguised by hay bales, and the enforcement proceedings which followed, are extreme examples of council interventions. And in reality, action is rare relative to the number of cases that councils receive, and that's really because of the discretionary nature of planning enforcement. So when assessing a breach of planning control, you have to consider if enforcement action is expedient. So in other words, is the level of harm so significant that it warrants formal action, or do the works generally comply with policies and guidance? And this is often referred to as the public interest test. And in dealing with members of the public and elected officials, it can be quite easy to cave to pressure, pursue formal action. And as an enforcement officer, you'll often come across neighbours who have an axe to grind against somebody else, and we want to use planning enforcement to punish somebody else. But the important thing to remember about planning enforcement, that it's not about punishing individuals, it's about remedying the harm where it occurs. And this position is supported by legislation, it's supported in government guidance, and it should be supported in enforcement plans as well. This can be quoted to members of the public should they question a decision to close a case. Indeed, only I think last week or the week before, I was threatened with legal action for one of my cases which I closed down. And that's just really part and parcel of being enforcement officers. Don't be scared when you get responses like that. If your decisions are sound, be competent in them. And be brave in your decisions. If it is a minor breach of planning control, or if it is acceptable in terms of planning policies and guidance, then it is entirely warranted to close a case without formal action. And we always remember that enforcement action should always be in the public interest. Now, where enforcement action is, where development is unacceptable in its current form, then the use of formal powers can be considered. But as a starting point, you should always try and negotiate with individuals to try and remedy a breach of planning control. And that's because any response to a breach of planning control should be proportionate. So as an enforcement officer, when you go out and look at a breach of planning control, always think, is there a way that we can negotiate an acceptable compromise to this? As ultimately negotiations can be a faster remedy than serving enforcement notice, which has a effective period, a compliance period, and it can be appealed to the appeals departments. In terms of formal powers that are available to councils, legislative documents can be quite wordy, they can be quite dry. So starting point, refer to councils' enforcement plans, and they should provide a succinct summary of the legislative powers that are available to officers. Now, some of these powers are more frequently used than others, such as planning contravention notices and enforcement notices. Stop notices are more extreme kind of examples of when the powers that can be used. But say these enforcement plans should set out the whole catalogue of powers which are available to you as an enforcement officer. And each council will have its own priorities when it comes to breach of planning control, and these priorities should also be set out within the enforcement plans. If not, you'll soon become aware of these priorities when you start your job. You start talking to your colleagues in the office. I myself had a bit of trial and error when I first started presenting action reports to my principal, which were then sent back to me because the level of harm was not significant enough. So it is a bit of trial and error when you first start as an enforcement officer, but you'll soon get into the swing of it. Shadowing is an important part, vitally important part of being a planning enforcement officer. That should be offered to you when you first start in a council. If not, ask for it. It is invaluable, as carrying out site inspection for the first time can be scary and daunting. And certainly when you see a colleague, a more experienced colleague doing it in practice, you can understand the demeanour you should be adopting, what kind of things you should be looking out for, what kind of questions you should be asking. And, really the final point would be that be positive about your career in planning enforcement, enthusiastic. It is a vital pillar of the planning system, upholding its integrity. And, I've been involved in planning enforcement for 6 years now and still enjoying the challenges that it throws up. And I think finally, transferable skills as well that you can learn through being a planning enforcement officer are also invaluable in terms of negotiation, team working and problem solving. So it's a really good profession to be involved in. So yeah, be confident and positive. And that's really all I've got to say on my section. So I'll pass you back to Neil now. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Craig. Right, we're going to move on to hear from Dawn Russell now. So Dawn is the Principal Planning Enforcement Officer at South Gloucestershire Council. And she leads a team of total of 10 planning enforcement officers, a very well resourced council. So you're doing quite well there, Dawn. She's worked in local authority planning enforcement for about 17 years and has gained a wide range of experience in planning enforcement matters and using planning enforcement toolkit. Dawn is also responsible for the authority's monitoring compliance service, determining planning applications on matters relating to planning enforcement investigations and carrying out CIL compliance visits. Prior to choosing a career in planning enforcement, Dawn's initial role was as a planning officer, determining planning applications. She's been a chartered member of the RTPI for 21 years and has represented the Southwest as on the NAPE committee for the last 5 years. So we're going to hand over to Dawn, who's going to talk to you a bit about what to do as an officer before you go on site. Over to you, Dawn.
Thank you. Okay, so as Neil says, I worked on the section which is entitled Before Going On Site. If you get a chance to have a look at it, you'll see that the section is actually only a few paragraphs in itself, but the main bulk of the information is held in the appendix as a checklist, which you can use to support yourself in your daily work on a regular basis. Hopefully it will be useful for that. In my view, it's absolutely essential that a planning enforcement officer is prepared before attending site to investigate a breach of planning control. I think it's something that people maybe forget as when they're planning their day, but it is essential, and it's really important that you understand what you need to gain from the site visit, that you have all the tools you need to obtain that information, that you have the confidence for why you're gaining that information in planning terms, and that you can keep yourself safe while you're carrying out your duties and often lone working. When thinking about why I thought it was important, most obviously, making sure that you gain all the information you need to determine the next steps of a planning enforcement investigation is the main purpose of the visit. Without prior consideration, you might not fully recognise which information is necessary, or you might perhaps forget to check or measure a detail that will end up making the next step decision impossible to determine. If you end up returning to the office with insufficient information, you'll probably have to go out again to finish the job. And that's time consuming and can appear unprofessional. Us planning enforcement officers usually carry a high caseload, and we don't have time to keep carrying out repeat visits. Thinking more on it, visiting it again for no good reason can also make the relationship with the landowner more strained, and it can make it harder to achieve resolution. And worst case scenario, doing that could risk the reputation of the local planning authority as a decision maker. So it's really important that we get it right. There's a section on having the right tools. It seems a simple point, and I acknowledge that the availability of the resources is between you and your line management. However, you must consider the implications of incorrect or non-exact evidence. You might need to show that a development's in accordance with the measurements on a plan, or if it's within an acceptable tolerance of that measurement. Perhaps it would be the difference between deciding that it's in accordance and therefore not a breach of planning control, or it could be a technical breach that is not expedient to pursue. You need to get your consideration clear. Having a camera to take photos is really useful evidence and is helpful when returning to an investigation after a few weeks and being able to remember exactly what's there. Sometimes you'll need a laser measure to establish the height or footprint of a development. Some sites might warrant the wearing of a body-worn camera. You might need to take and record evidence under caution. We even have an old school trundle wheel in case you need to measure a field. And we are considering the use of drones, which some authorities have done. My experience so far confirms to me that an officer who has a full understanding of why they are on site, the planning and context of what they are investigating, and they're well versed in the next possible steps that could happen, they will appear confident, professional, and relaxed when talking to local residents, will often be able to resolve matters much more quickly and respond to complainants much more comprehensively, perhaps closing more cases. I'm sure it'll be mentioned in more detail later, but it's also important to remember that evidence gained on site may not only be used to make an initial expediency decision, it might be used to justify that a formal notice should be served or used in court as evidence for prosecution proceedings or injunctive relief. Your evidence could be tested or cross-examined. The outcome of an investigation would depend upon the evidence that you provide, so being fully prepared can only make the evidence gathered more comprehensive and more robust. In the hope to steer officers in the right direction, this section of the guide provides just a simple tick list as a prompt for all of the things that you should take time to consider before visiting site. Many of the points will be or will become second nature and take no time at all, but it's important that they're done. Finally, you will see that the section includes information on training, which I hope will be a useful tool if needed with line management to ensure that you get all the training that you need. You'll be able to see that the training identified covers more than just understanding planning legislation and guidance as a planning officer might need, but it also covers practical matters such as ensuring you are clear on the regulations of surveillance, you're prepared on properly taking interviews under caution. Most importantly, you need to be given the skills to deal with people on site, managing discussions, keeping yourself safe if you find yourself in a conflict situation or with an aggressive person. So I just urge you to take time to have a look at it, take time to make sure that you receive the kind of training we've listed on there and that you get regular refreshers. That's important too. I hope you find it useful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dawn. Next, we are going to hear from Richard Marshall. Richard is the Midlands NAPE representative and is currently employed as a Senior Planning Enforcement Officer at Newark and Sherwood District Council. Richard has been working in planning enforcement since 2005 and held positions as officer and senior officer at a number of LPAs in the Midlands and the South of England. So we're going to hear from Richard now. He's going to talk to you about what to do as an officer when you are actually on site. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Neil. Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. I think the section of the guide that I've authored dovetails nicely with what Dawn's just discussed, to be honest with you. I was quite pleased to be given this section of the guide to author because for me, and I imagine with many new officers, actually going on site and undertaking a site visit, it's one of the most interesting, stimulating and sometimes enjoyable, but always challenging aspects of the planning enforcement role. As Dawn's already said, and I think Craig said before, ideally a new officer would be mentored when they've just started the role and would be taken out on site visits by experienced officers and shown the ropes. However, because of increasing pressures on officers' time and particularly safe working methods during COVID at the moment, this isn't potentially always possible or as much as it has been traditionally. And therefore, I see that this guide is going to be particularly helpful at the moment where these challenges are in place. I still remember now when I started doing site visits myself in my first role at Chelmsford Borough Council, that apparent freedom and that ability to go out on site and see things and cut those ropes to the office was one of the best things about the role. But I shudder now and perhaps sometimes blush at some of the situations I might have got myself involved with where I just rushed out without some of the preparation that Dawn's talked about. and perhaps wasn't fully prepared or acted in the right way when I was on site. So I think some of the guidance contained within this guide would be vital for new officers. Because obviously, as we know, most site visits, they're very rarely simple, and they're quite often challenging and complicated. So the better you can be prepared, and the better your conduct is on site, it's always going to make the experience better for yourself and those involved in the enforcement process, whether that be the contraveners or the complainants. Whilst it's on site, it's key that officers ensure that at all times they act in a professional and courteous manner, as befits a professional officer representing their employer and ultimately their profession as a planning enforcement officer. I think it's important that officers always remember that ultimately an undertaking site visits to gather information that is essential to the enforcement investigation, and therefore they need to remember to remain in control of the site visits at all time, as conflict or emotion with the complainant or the contravener is unlikely to be productive in the site visit. Basically, it's about keeping discussions on topic and avoiding the he said, she said discussions and debates that people like to engage in. Nevertheless, new officers must also be aware that however well they prepare for a site visit, as Dawn's obviously explained, and however professional an officer's conduct on site, ultimately they're investigating an alleged breach of planning control, and therefore it's possible, perhaps I should say it's likely, that there won't be a welcome presence on site, and therefore officers should always remember that behaviour management is key. Whilst the site visit could be vital to the outcome of a planning enforcement investigation, it's important at all times that a new officer, or any officer for that matter, remembers that ultimately their safety and the safety of other members of the public is paramount at all times, and therefore an officer should be aware of how to manage possible hostile situations and techniques to either minimise risk or to extract themselves from a potentially conflict situation when necessary. I believe there's more guidance on this within section 4 to follow shortly. I think Tom's authored that section. The guide provides information of the 2 strands of a site visit, site safety and gathering information. This includes several techniques to remain safe on site. Simple things such as parking a vehicle facing an unobstructed exit and wearing the correct PPE clothing, as well as a number of steps to go through to ensure that sufficient useful information is gathered in the course of the site visit or inspection. I think Dawn's covered a lot of this with equipment already, but as new officers, the worst thing you want to do is go on site and your camera batteries have run out, or a hostile situation flares up and you're having to do a 10-point turn to get off the site. So I think for new officers, there's those simple hints and guidance there to help the visits be more productive and effective. Ultimately, I think as everybody will concur as part of this presentation, preparation and conduct are the key aspects to be considered whilst on site. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Richard. I particularly like the little flowchart you put in your section of the guide. It's very useful, nice, quick, handy guide to refer to. So yeah, thank you for that. And as Richard touched on, obviously as enforcement officers, we're not always welcome to somebody's particular site when we're out investigating breaches of planning control. So we're going to hear from Tom Wicks now on that particular point of dealing with conflict on site. So Tim has been an enforcement officer for 10 years and is qualified in planning and law. He has worked within a number of London boroughs and rural planning authorities. He is experienced in all aspects of planning enforcement, including site visits, public inquiries, prosecutions, and direct remedial action. So likely to have plenty of experience of on-site conflicts dealing with that. He's also the NAPE representative for the South East. And Tom believes that local planning authorities have all the powers necessary to remedy any breach of planning control, and is yet to find a planning problem that there isn't an effective solution to. Unfortunately, Tom can't join us with his camera, but he is on the phone and should be joining us now. Tom, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please fire away.
Sorry, I can't be there. I'm having some technical difficulties, but I'm here on the phone anyway. I think Dawn and Richard and the other speakers have really helped in making some key points in terms of dealing with conflict on site, in that preparation is key, and knowing why you're there will really help resolve any conflict that does occur. But the key thing I would stress is that you're not there to deal with conflict. If there is conflict on site, the first option is always to leave. You don't need to be there. There's no purpose. There's no good outcome that comes from conflict. You're there to look at the development, to weigh it against planning policy, to gather information and to share that information. There's no point in winning an argument on site or trying to explain the technicalities of permitted development to an angry farmer or someone who thinks they've done everything within the guidelines and haven't. There's no need to be committal on site. You don't need to tell anyone that yes, this is acceptable, or no, this isn't acceptable. That's not really a decision that you can make on the spot. So you could be non-committal. You can say, well, I've come here to have a look. I'm going to take some photographs. I'm going to see what's here, and then I'm going to report back to the council and talk to my colleagues, and we'll weigh that against planning policy. And the first option is to write to me if there's anything you want to say, and I will write to you if there's anything I want to say. So I don't think there's anything to be gained from conflict on site necessarily, and you shouldn't go to a site with the person's personality or the history in your mind. I think if you go to a site thinking, oh, this guy's been a bit nasty in the past, or he's got a reputation, or he's known for having an argument, you'll probably find you enter site with a bit apprehensively and a bit ready to argue, and I don't think there's anything to be gained from that, and certainly that's not your job. The second thing I'd say is that really there are very, very few circumstances where conflict arises in general planning terms. Site visits are really just taking photographs and gathering information. As a beginner planning officer, you shouldn't be there in a situation on your own where there's likely to be conflict. And okay, we do have to deal with some conflict in terms of taking default action or visiting sites where there has been a history of conflict, but in those circumstances you should have assistance, and whether it be police or other authorities there to help you, and it's not your job to deal with that conflict. So don't ever be scared to just run away. I think that's the most effective tool when faced with conflict, is to run away. But certainly that I'm not shy of doing, and I'm not there, even if I'm dealing with difficult situations, I'm not there to look tough or to win an argument or to stare someone down. I'm just going to run away if things get nasty. It's not worth it. But if you are faced with conflict, then it is very important that you record that conflict. And if you can, then carry on a dialogue with the person that's obstructing you. If they are refusing to identify themselves, then explain to them, well, I'll write down that there was a person here that prevented me from doing my job, and I'm going to write that down and share that information with the council. And this is your opportunity to tell me why you don't want to be here, or you don't want me to be here, or if there's anything you don't want me to see and why. And if, for example, I don't want to let you in this building, then tell me why. And if they won't tell me why, then I'm going to have to come back at some point, and it might be that I come back without notice or with other people, and you won't have an option whether to let me on or not. So it's really important that you identify the nature of their objection to you being there, and explain your purpose and share that information with other people, because you never know, you might get back to the office and for one reason or another you don't go back to this site and it's passed on to someone else. And if you haven't recorded this information, they may be walking into this site not knowing that there has been a history of conflict and may make things worse. But it's not necessarily a bad thing if you get conflict on site. Sometimes it's useful if for example someone tells you to go away and you're never coming back here or whatever, and shouts and swears at you. That's something you can write down, and you can reference that in your appeal statement or whatever. And if you've got some part of the enforcement notice wrong or whatever because you haven't been able to get in, then you can't be blamed for that. So don't think that if you are faced with conflict and
I think we may have lost Tom. He seemed to cut off rather abruptly there. I don't think anyone else can hear him, can you? Give me a quick shake of the head. Oh dear. Okay, we've lost Tom. Okay, well, I'm sure Jenny behind the scenes is working frantically to try and get him back on. But what I think we'll do now, as we have lost him, we'll move on. We can always come back to Tom if we're able to get him back on the line. So we'll move on then to the next part of the guide, and we're gonna now look at what to do after the site visit has taken place. So we're going to hear from Chris Blair. So Chris is currently a planning manager for planning enforcement and trees at Ards and North Down Borough Council in Northern Ireland. He's a chartered member of the RTPI and has had the privilege of representing Northern Ireland on the NAPE Executive Committee since February 2016. Chris has primarily worked in planning enforcement teams since 2007, with the exception of an 18-month period where he was working in development management, initially in Belfast and then in Lisbon City. He has been with Ards and North Down Borough Council since April 2015, and before that he worked for the Department of Environment and Planning between 2002 and 2015, and from 2002 to 2007 he was Development Management Case Officer in DOE planning offices in Craigavon, and for 1 year and the rest of the time in Ballymena. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Chris is a BHC Honours in Town and Regional Planning from the University of Dundee. Now, Chris is with us today, but unfortunately, he's lost his voice. Rather handily, before he lost his voice, he was able to record a short video, which will basically cover what he was going to say, which we'll play for you now.
Hi there, my name is Chris Blair and I am the Northern Ireland representative on the NAPE Management Committee. I am looking at the subject of post-site inspections within the beginner's guide. So just going to make a start here now. First up is just the top tips we have. First off is to ensure that we can exit the site safely. So that's the first top tip that we need to look at. Secondly is to stay in contact with your office. And then thirdly is record, sign and date all evidence gathered. So I'll just look at those in a bit more detail in a wee moment. However, these are three really good top tips to sort of stay in touch with how you should work in relation to the post-site inspections. And if you get these three in your head, actually, everything else becomes the norm when you start working as a planning enforcement officer. So just moving on to leaving the site. First up is to ensure that your vehicle is facing an exit, just as you've already heard in section 3. So this is the same case as for post-site inspection. So your vehicle should be facing an exit, so you're able to leave a site in good, efficient time or quickly if necessary. Also, just ensure as well that your vehicle isn't obstructed or blocked in any way. Make sure as well that you have everything with you when you leave the site. So everything you brought on, for example, your site notes, your phone, your camera, measuring equipment, and also importantly your warrant card that has your identity on it. It's important that you have all those things as you leave, especially in the case maybe from once in a blue moon that you maybe have to leave a site quickly. Also, it's important to try and ensure that you keep in contact with your office or your colleagues or your line manager as much as possible. This is particularly in relation to sites where you've maybe pre-arranged to go onto a site, and it's your officer, your colleague needs to know when you start the site inspection and also end it. So make sure that you remember to do this. Also, at the end of site visits throughout on a day, it's important that you contact your office and let them know that you've finished. For example, where I work, we have a system where we contact our line manager and inform them that we have finished for the end of the day. So this is just an important factor to remember. Also, it's important to remember if you're on a site with 2 officers, that you don't just leave the other officer to do it. You don't just assume that that person will contact the office at the end of that site visit. So make sure that you have a plan in action, that one of you is going to contact your line manager, or you make the decision and contact them yourself. So that is basically like general post-site inspection. But moving on as well, it's important to remember if you decide to do a site visit that is unplanned, make sure you contact your office before you go onto it, and then also again once you leave. This is important because you just don't know what you're going to face coming onto a site. It could be just a private house, it might be fine, or it could be a property, maybe an HMO, or going on to a large commercial site where you just don't know the people you come across or the situation you're going to be in. So it's important to keep in touch with your office. If you do have any concerns, and this is extremely rare, but if you do have any concerns after your site visit that you feel you're being followed, either by another vehicle or on foot, make sure that you contact the police at the safest possible opportunity, or if you're in a vehicle and you're within a town area, just drive straight to the nearest police station. This just ensures that you're safe and well, and ultimately your safety is of the most ultimate and paramount importance. I would say here as well, don't try and turn around and confront somebody, because you just don't know how they're feeling, what their viewpoints are, if they're alone, or if there's somebody maybe close behind them. So just try and avoid confrontation at all times. And again, we aren't the police. We are there just to assess whether there's been a breach of planning control, and that is it. So try and avoid confrontation. Also, just importantly, if you have that sort of circumstance, let's hope that that is never the case, but if it is, make sure you keep your office up to date as well. It's important that your line manager knows the difficulties you've been facing and going through. So we're just going to move on now to information gathered on site. This is just, I'm not going to go through all this detail because this is on the beginner's guide, and it lists everything that I would go through. But it's important to remember when you make a site note of your visit that you go through all the information that's provided there, and you consider all the necessary things you need to take on board. Also, on occasions it may not be possible to take site notes while you're on the site itself, so try and be observant as possible. Take into account all the surrounding environment, the people you've met, the potential breaches of planning control that you've maybe witnessed, operational development that's maybe been ongoing on the site, new buildings are under construction, maybe different uses that are ongoing at the site that shouldn't be there. So try and build up as much as possible in your mind, and if you can, take as many photographs as possible, whether this is on a camera or on a phone. And when you leave the site, make sure that you are able to do up a site note as quickly as you can, preferably within 20 to 30 minutes maximum from when you leave the site, so all the information that you have observed is fresh in your memory and mind. And finally, just when you do your site note up, make sure that you sign and date it, and then attach it to the enforcement file when you're out on site, if you can do. That's important, and it ensures that it's there and you're able to look back at it in the future. So when you're back in the office or at home, of course, as well, as the case may be at the moment, it's important that you save and date and document all the information you have gathered. First up, I would advise that as soon as you can, make sure that you put your inspection date into the computer system that you use. Make sure you save and document all the photographs you've taken, any measurements you've taken in terms of spot levels, measurements of buildings, details you've witnessed. So try and scan those into your system, or if you're transferring them from a phone or camera, print them off, sign and date them, attach them to the hard copy of the enforcement file. And just as a backup, it's also good to try and add these to a digital copy. So scan them on and save them onto your laptop or computer at your earliest possible convenience. It's important to do this so there's a timeline of all events that are taking place in relation to the breach that maybe you've witnessed or the detail that you're gradually gathering at a site. So try and ensure that that's the case. Also, make sure that you try and record the names and addresses of all the people you meet on site, whether that's an operator or an owner, whatever the case may be. Make sure you detail this information and record it on your computer system as quickly as you can. So just to go back again, that's really the main topics. The vast majority of this information, of course, all of this information is in the beginner's guide, and it'll be hopefully a really helpful tool as you start off a career as a planning enforcement officer. Obviously, there's some circumstances I've stated here could be extreme, especially in relation to leaving sites and maybe having to leave sites quickly. However, as time goes on, you'll be able to gather your own experience and be able to assess what you do on a site every time you go onto it. But these are good habits to get into. And again, it's just to remember the 3 top tips. It's just to exit a site as safely and as quickly as you can. Make sure you have everything with you. Stay in contact with your office when you need to. And also record, sign and date all the evidence you gathered. And if you undertake those 3 steps through each investigation that you undertake, these will help you carry out an efficient and effective enforcement investigation. I hope those are helpful. I apologise for my voice. I've hardly any voice. I've been struggling with laryngitis, so hopefully you can hear me okay. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. Got that video recorded just in the nick of time by all accounts. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so we're going to move on to one of the last sections of the guide, and we're going to hear from Craig Allison and Liam Jones, who authored this section together. Liam is a team leader for Swansea Council, heading up the Bay City Centre team in dealing with planning applications, enforcement investigations and appeals. Prior to this, Liam has held roles as Head of Development Management and Principal Planner at the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority and has worked as a Planning Enforcement Officer at the Vale of Glamorgan Council. Liam is passionate about effective enforcement, which stems from his past role working as an enforcement officer dealing with the full spectrum of enforcement and compliance related issues. He is also keen to ensure that planners become upskilled in dealing with enforcement issues. And Craig Allison is currently a Senior Planning Enforcement Officer at Hambleton District Council and is currently the NAPE Vice Chair and North of England Representative for Enforcement Officers. He has previously held roles as an enforcement officer at Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council and South Oxfordshire District Council, and has been involved in enforcement since 2012, following graduating from university with a master's degree in urban studies and planning at the University of Sheffield. Craig has played an active role within NAPE by being the author of a number of sections of the handbook, which we previously published, as well as the Beginner's Guide. And he's contributed to discussions on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and presented a number of topics for the RTPI on various enforcement matters around the country. So we're going to be hearing from them now. Over to you guys.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to introduce looking at the initial evidence section. So effectively, you've done your site visit. You should have gathered a bit of information about the complaint and the alleged breach. You've done the fact finding in essence. So the next stage really is to carry out a bit of a desktop investigation. What I mean by this is to sort of carry out a full appraisal of the background or history of the site and then any other records that you might have or are able to look at. So if you haven't had an opportunity before you've gone to your site, now is really the time to look through your previous or current applications on the site, be it approvals, refusals, get an understanding of the planning issues arising from them, pre-applications and other information requests that the department might have had, as well as look outside your section. Building regulations applications can sort of give you a clearer picture of what's going on at the site. So might sound obvious. I know others have spoke about it, but enforcement records, they're essential. Make sure you've got your photos from your visit and see if you can get hold of any older photos if officers have been to the site previously. Moving on from this, you need to sort of look at some key questions. So that's what the guide is really getting to. Have a look at the evidence you've obtained, your measurements, your photos, your discussions. But you need to take a balanced view, so don't get drawn into disputes as a result of your site visit, but have a real focus. And I think the focus should be the first question that we've put there. Consider whether the works actually constitute development or not. We all know complaints can be wide-ranging, quite various, particularly neighbour disputes. But you really need to focus on this question at the start. So have a look at Section 55 of the Planning Act. That's your starting point. Ask yourself, do the works comprise of building operations, engineering operations, or material change of use? That's to be development. So it's not always clear, but have the tests of size, permanence, and physical attachment to the ground. Have those in the back of your mind. Again, photos will help you, and they could help you at the later appeal stage. So make use of any case law on the subject matter. So you might have a particular development which is similar to a case that's been dealt with elsewhere, and then use local officer discussion groups as well to share knowledge locally. And NAPE, of course, and you use those platforms. So obviously, if the works are not development, you can't take the case any further. So you'll need to close it in line with any procedures that your local planning authority has. On the second question we put, are the works permitted development? So once you're satisfied the works are development, you need to look at whether they're permitted in your area, decide whether the works would be permitted and not need an application, for example. Now, these PD rights, they differ across the regions. Working in Wales, we have the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order of 95, amended in 2013 for householder works. This effectively allows a range of works to be undertaken without needing planning permission. So you need to get to grips with that. A number of your complaints, they're likely to be householder type complaints, works of dwellings in gardens. It's essential really to have that knowledge. So really take the time to go through and check whether the works are permitted development. If they are, that's great, you can close your case. The next item then is severity of the breach. So if the works of development, they're not permitted, you need to consider the severity of the works, whether you need to explore, for example, a temporary stop notice or a stop notice if works are clearly ongoing and not likely to stop. So we've included some references in the guide there to the Enforcement Handbook. So familiarise yourself with the benefits of both before considering them. I mean, in practice, stop notices would be reserved for developments with sort of irreversible impacts. You need to stop them immediately. Action would need to be expedient, and you need to consider the compensation grounds going forward. So you know, they're not likely to be useful on the majority of application types or development types. So they also need to be served alongside a full enforcement notice. Other measures, temporary stop notice can be useful because they can require that landowner to cease work for up to 28 days. So it gives that little bit of grace period to allow a full exploration of whether the works are acceptable that they're actually undertaking. If you decide not to issue a stop notice, which is probably more likely for minor and householder type works, you then need to focus on the next question would be, would the local planning authority grant planning permission for the alleged breach? So that leads me on to the question of, are the works acceptable? So in the scenario that you feel the planning permission may be granted for the works, you should write to the landowner, set this out to them, be clear about what you're requesting, and request that in a reasonable time frame. So if you're requesting a planning application, for example, give the landowner 28 days to submit that application. In an ideal scenario, the application would deal with the planning impacts and would be approved, and you can close your enforcement case. But obviously that doesn't always happen. If they don't submit an application, you need to consider expediency, and we touched on it earlier. Refer to section 3.3 of the main handbook for the tests of expediency. I think the critical thing to understand from an enforcement perspective is the absence of a planning permission would not be a reason to take enforcement action. So if the development undertaken is acceptable, then it would be likely that you would be closing the case as not expedient. And so to really have that scenario in your mind. The last section we put, I mean, it is brief, but it just covers the key points on pursuing enforcement action. So in the scenario, you know, a planning permission wouldn't be forthcoming, you're likely going to need to serve an enforcement notice. Now, before you do that, it's always best practice to get full facts about the development. So serve what is called a planning contravention notice or requisition for information. Ask the right questions. Have a real focus on the type of information you need going forward. I found they can be really useful when you come to an appeal situation, because you're looking back at this moment in time of when the development happened. You've got key facts from the landowner. When did the works happen? You can ask anything on a planning contravention notice that you can tie back to being reasonable. So use them and use them before you take action. Land registry searches. Again, it's important to know who the landowner is, and are there any other interested parties that you need to serve your notice on. And the final point there is make sure you have the written approval. So whether that is delegated to senior officers or via your planning committee process to actually serve the notice. So make sure that is all tied up. It's essential if you're later going down the prosecution route and you need to have that information, the evidence that you have had the correct authority to serve your notice. You might have a local enforcement plan or procedures in your authority which will help set that in a bit more detail. But ultimately, make sure that your focus in the report is on the harm arising from the development. So use all that evidence you've had from your site visits, from looking at the planning policy situation to help support your case, and have that real focus on, well, you're taking enforcement action because you're taking it to remove the harm arising from a development. That brings me to the close of mine. I'll pass you back then. Thank you.
Suppose now I will go on to my section. I just want to make sure that people can actually hear me, because when I did the conference, nobody could hear me. So if everybody can hear me, I will carry on unless I hear otherwise in the chat. But I did have a backup just in case. So yeah, the section that I wrote in the handbook was sources of good information. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. There is so many sources of information to look out there for people. But I've just put some key ones down there for people to have a look at and to use, because unfortunately, when you first start off as an enforcement officer, and I suppose it's with any job, you've got to do a lot of reading. and there is a lot of reading with enforcement. You've got to understand all the various tools that you have, all the various legislation, and it's worth pointing out that you are never going to remember it all. There's so many times I've been doing this job for nearly 10 years, and probably people who've been doing it a lot longer always have to refer back to various documents because the wording slightly changes all the time, or you've got to work out. Enforcement's very specific in terms of how it's wording, so it's important to go back to those points, those bits of legislation to have a look at. So I think the first thing I would look at initially when starting would be just starting with the NPPF, looking at paragraph 59. It's a very short paragraph for enforcement, but just having a read of what it actually says, making sure that we're being proportionate in terms of taking enforcement action if we need to. Following on from that, the next stage I would look at would be to look at, I'm going to plug our enforcement handbook, which was produced last year. Obviously, that gives you an idea of all the tools that you have available to you as an enforcement officer. Obviously, I know it's specifically for England, but these are similar tools that can be used in all the regions around the UK, obviously under different legislation, but they're very similar. But I would have a look at everything that's available to us. There's some very good topics in there, and for you to have a read of those tools. Once you've had an understanding of what tools you have available, I would probably go and have a little read of the of the Town and Country Planning Act, reading from section 170, 72, I believe, and just go and have a read from there of all what it actually says. It is very wordy, it's very complicated. Government don't like to make our jobs very easy with all these words in there, but have a read of it, have an understanding of what is required to be put in a notice, because that specifically says to make a lawful notice, it specifically says what needs to be included in it and how it should be done. Little things like that, how to do a breach of condition notice, stop notice, what is required on all those matters. Have a look at what the law actually says. And obviously you can refer that back to the enforcement handbook and have a read of that. It's always useful to compare the two. They'll be very similar, but it'll give you an understanding of what the law actually requires you to do as an enforcement officer. I think generally speaking, when you first start, well, when I first started and most people first start in enforcement, is you generally deal with no job's simple, but the simpler jobs in terms of householders. So breaches of householder PD and things along those lines, where people building sheds, fences, that sorts of situation. There's a very useful tool in terms of on the planning portal website, where there's like an interactive house. So go on there, have a look at that, and have a little play of what people. Basically it's for a layman's person to have an understanding of what they can and cannot do without planning permission. So have a little look at that, see what people can do, and obviously then you can refer back to the actual law itself in terms of the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order, which Liam's already referred to in the previous sections. So I'd have a look at that and have a read of what people can do with PD. Obviously, PD itself is such a wide topic. Obviously, you've got mainly householders, but you've got things to do with agricultural, industrial sites, all sorts of things. And just remember, you will not remember it all because it changes all the time. So just keep going back, there's things of ways to be able to keep a tab of any bits of change of legislation and have a look at that and change it and just have a read of it. So the most recent one is 2015, but there are numerous amendments up to 2021. So just keep on having a look out of what changes all the time, because there will be some ones that will change in the future ones, which will just it might be just they've added one word into a particular sentence, but that could change the whole complete concept of whether it's PD or not. So just keep an eye on everything that comes in terms of changes. Again, have a look at the change of use. Obviously that recently changed as well, all the different use classes. So again, have an idea of what people can do in terms of changing various buildings with or without planning permission. I'd also go back to, there's very good guidance that's been set up for other bits of legislation and other bits of potential breaches. You've got the Town and Country Planning Control of Advertisement Regulations, which I think, in my opinion, is probably one of the best things that the RTPI has done in terms of the government's done, in terms of a nice colourful document, and it's very easy to read in terms of what people can do in terms of displaying advertisements with or without advertisement consent. So again, have a read of that. There's also guidance on section 2 and 5 notices, which also includes template letters to send to people and also template notices. And if the government have suggested these letters to use them. They're there to be used. Have a use of them. And the same, I think there's also template planning contravention notices as well. Obviously, you've got to add your own questions in, but the general template of what to use is there, which has been produced by the government. So if they're suggesting that's the right way to use it, use them. They're there for you to available to use, to have a go at them. The other thing I would also suggest reading is every council should have a local enforcement plan, which I think has already been referred to earlier. That will give you an idea of how your council should react to various breaches. What's their timescales? What's their procedures? Have a read of that, because if you come to a stage where you're going to a prosecution at a later stage, a lot of solicitors and lawyers will go back to what your enforcement plan says. So if your enforcement plan says we are going to send a letter out following a breach and we've got to give them 28 days to apply for planning permission, for example, make sure you give them the 28 days, because if you give it shorter, they could come up and try and argue the case. You don't want to have any complications just on procedure. So just read your local enforcement plan of what it says and use that to your advantage. There's obviously other things, like everybody be aware of Google and Street View. So they have various tools which will help you in terms of determining immunity and having a look at photographs on there. It's always a very useful tool to use. But like I say, the general list is not exhaustive. There are so many sources of information out there, but that's just a general overview of the key ones that I would use as a starting point to have a read of. It will be very mundane, some of it. It's getting very monotonous, but just read it and you'll get an idea, and always have those documents saved on your desktop and you can refer back to them at any particular point. So I'll pass back over to Neil.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Craig. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so there were a few questions on the Q&A tab, but what we'll do, we'll try and get back to those who have asked those questions. Also, for NAPE members, remember we have the monthly Ask NAPE, which goes out on our monthly newsletter. So if you have got any questions, please feel free to send those into to the committee, or the member of the committee who's dealing with it this month, who I believe is Chris, is the lucky person dealing with it for this month. So please feel free to drop those questions in there. But for the ones that have put them on the questions and answers tabs, we will endeavour to get back to you with some answers on those. So really, just one more plug for the beginner's guide. Please feel free to go onto the NAPE section of the RTPI website and download your free copy. There's also the Enforcement Handbook, which we launched last year. That's on there free of charge. You don't have to be a member of NAPE to benefit from that. If you are eligible to join NAPE, if you're a member of the RTPI, please do come and join us. We've got well over 1,000 members at the moment, and we are kind of the national body for enforcement. So if there's any questions you have about enforcement, or there's something you want us to raise with the government, please feel free to drop us a line. So all the delegates that have attended today, you should shortly receive a link to a survey asking for your feedback from the webinar today. We'd really appreciate if you took the time to fill that in and send us back. Obviously, we'll take any comments into consideration, and will help us put on bigger and better events, hopefully, in the future. Today marks the last event, which Jenny from the RTPI will be helping us out with. Jenny's going to be moving on to a new position within the RTPI. So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank her for all her efforts over the last couple of years of putting on the conference and basically administering everything that goes along with NAPEs and making sure we all run smoothly. So thank you for Jenny. We really appreciate what you've done for us. That means that we will be having, or we have, a new network manager, Madeline Bauer. So we'd like to welcome her to the committee, and we look forward to working with her in the coming months and years. With regards to NAPE, we have some elections coming up in January, and we are going to be looking for representatives for London and the East of England, South East England, Scotland and Wales. So if you're a NAPE member and you're interested in standing as part of the election, details about that will be going out in the December newsletter. So please keep an eye out for that. So really that just leaves me to say thank you very much for everybody who's contributed today, the whole of the NAPE Management Committee, and also to Tim Crawshaw, soon to be president of the RTPI. We really appreciate your support. We think it's really important that someone in your position has taken and will continue, we hope, to take an interest in enforcement. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to attend today and the conference a few weeks ago. And now I'll hand over to Tim just to say a few closing words.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I suppose in closing, I'd say if you are a beginner, good luck in your new career. Hope you find it satisfying and interesting. And you can certainly see that people who've been in it a while have certainly got a lot of passion for what they do. And I've never done it, but I suspect it's a very stimulating and exciting role. So good luck to everybody. And again, thanks for having me here. I'd like to stay in touch with the enforcement scene next year in my presidential role. And I have made an offer that if anyone wants to show me a day in the life of the enforcement officer so I can do some publicity around that, I'm very happy to come along and walk alongside and be out there with somebody if they want to do that, and we can talk about that potentially through the presidential role. So thanks very much for having me. Merry Christmas, everybody, and a fantastic 2022. Thank you. Cheers.